The moment Kirk Cousins spun around on Will Anderson Jr. after getting clipped on the arm, the whole tenor of that Houston practice field changed for anyone paying attention. Joint practices don't keep a score, so you can't point to a number and say who won. You have to read it in body language instead, and body language was screaming by Thursday afternoon. Veteran quarterbacks don't usually snap back at a defender mid-rep unless something's been building underneath the surface for a while, and by the time that exchange happened, plenty had already piled up for Las Vegas. I know the instinct with joint practices is to wave the whole thing off, and most of the time that instinct is correct. Nobody's full game plan is installed in August, starters get pulled early, and coaches script situations that don't always resemble how a real Sunday unfolds. But every so often a session produces enough consistent signal across enough different position groups that ignoring it stops being reasonable. This felt like one of those days, not because of one dominant sequence, but because so many separate storylines all pointed toward the same conclusion at the same time. Before I get into any of the tape, I need to walk through the injury news, because it colors everything else I'm about to tell you. Jackson Powers Johnson went down Monday. He walked off under his own power, which counts for something, but he sat out the entire joint session Thursday, and Clint Kubiak already told reporters he doesn't expect his starting right guard to suit up for the actual preseason game either. Jeremy Fowler's reporting has this labeled as short-term, so nobody needs to spiral. But I'll be honest with you, my stomach drops a little every time this guy's name shows up on an injury report, because we're starting to see a pattern here in year 3. When Powers Johnson is healthy and on the field, he might be the most complete interior lineman on this entire roster. He climbs to the second level cleanly. He bails out his center. He cleans up for the tackle next to him. He does all the invisible work that never trends on social media, but always shows up the moment you pull the coach's tape. Talent was never the question with this guy. Availability is the question. And availability doesn't care how good you look on paper. It stings even more given exactly who was lined up across from him this week. Houston isn't just a good defensive front. There's a legitimate case they're the best one in football right now, with Anderson and Danielle Hunter working the edges and a defensive tackle rotation that isn't far behind either of them. Losing your best interior blocker in the same week you're walking into that buzzsaw is about as badly timed as it gets. I keep circling back to that word, availability, because it really is the entire equation with Powers Johnson. Nobody in that building doubts what his ceiling looks like. Go pull up last season's tape if you want proof. What's harder to answer is whether his body lets him string together 16 or 17 of his best games in a row, and right now, heading into year 3, that question doesn't have a confident answer attached to it yet. Coaches can scheme around a lot of problems. An empty spot on the depth chart isn't one of them. Now let's actually get into what happened on the field, and I want to be straight with you that I wasn't standing on that Houston turf myself. Everything here is pieced together from clips and from reporters who were actually on site. But when enough independent accounts start lining up on the same details, a pretty clear picture forms, and this particular picture isn't flattering for the Las Vegas defense, or maybe I should say it isn't flattering for the offense that had to stand in against it. There's a throw going around online where Fernando Mendoza locks in on a receiver crossing the middle, and Jalen Petrie jumps the route and comes away with the pick. My first reaction watching it was pure confusion. How do you put the ball in that exact window with a defender already sitting right there? Then I rewound the clip, and the real story was up front, not downfield. DJ Glaze gets beaten instantly off the snap by Will Anderson. The pressure shows up almost immediately, and Mendoza feels the rush closing and rushes his decision because of it. That's the domino effect nobody mentions when a clip like that gets posted with just the final result attached. It's rarely purely the quarterback's fault when a throw like this happens under duress, and this one wasn't either. Keep watching, and you'll catch Caleb Rogers passing off a defensive tackle stunt to Tyler Lindenberg and trying to scrape back over to help Glaze, except he arrives a half step too late. Lindenberg, expecting help that never fully materializes, gets beaten clean over the top on that exact same rep. So what you're actually looking at isn't one guy having a rough snap. It's a coverage bust downfield, a rush decision in the pocket, and 2 separate breakdowns up front, all compounding on the same play. That kind of pileup happens far more in August than it will in October, but it's still worth flagging as we head toward the fall. Picture the timeline for a second. Glaze is already losing ground before he's even planted his second step. Mendoza feels the pocket collapsing from his blind side. In that split second, he has to pick between climbing, escaping, or trusting a route that hasn't fully developed. He trusts the route, Petrie makes him pay for it. None of that context shows up when the highlight gets clipped and shared, but it tells you exactly where the real fix needs to happen, and it isn't in the quarterback room. I don't want to paint the whole trench battle as a disaster, because it genuinely wasn't. Spencer Burford had a rep against a Texans defensive tackle where he just anchored and refused to give up a single inch. And that might have been the cleanest individual snap of the entire session. On the other side, Danielle Hunter got into Coulter Miller with a long arm and drove him backward. But that's actually a survivable outcome for a tackle as long as the quarterback can step up into the pocket, because Hunter's now working around the arc instead of running a straight line through the guard. The real issue on that particular play wasn't the edge at all. It was interior pressure collapsing the middle and taking away Mendoza's ability to climb. And that's what actually set up the pick six Petrie took to the house. There was a second turnover that bothered me even more, and it's the one sticking with me heading into the regular season. Woody Marks slips through what looks like a fully busted assignment near the goal line. And from the broadcast angle, I genuinely couldn't find a single Raiders defender within 5 yards of him by the time he crossed the plane. Quay Walker's somewhere in that frame. There's a safety visible too. But nobody actually accounts for the running back leaking out of the backfield. That's not a talent issue. That's a communication issue. And communication issues in August are supposed to get cleaned up through reps, not stacked on top of a problem I've been flagging since the offseason. That other problem is the run defense, and I'm not going to soften it. This isn't new if you've been following me for a while. Back in January and February, I was already saying this roster had a real hole at defensive tackle that nobody seemed to be treating with any urgency. And here we are in August, watching that exact weakness surface in back-to-back joint sessions. First against Arizona, and now against a Houston offensive line that reportedly moved the ball on the ground with relative ease. Multiple reporters on site described the same scene. Houston starters opening up running lanes without much resistance, while the Raiders were still generating legitimate pass rush pressure at the same time. That split tells you almost everything you need to know. The edge rushers can get home. The interior can't hold its ground. Tyree Wilson and Malcolm Kuntze, whoever ends up rushing off the edge on a given snap, clearly have juice. But Thomas Booker and Jonah Laulu look more like depth pieces than starters, and through a handful of live reps. Tano Kapasanaon hasn't shown me the disruptive flashes I'm hoping for from a player. This coaching staff is counting on to become a real answer up front. Compare that to how a rookie like Jalen Carter looked in his earliest preseason snaps a couple years back, where within 2 or 3 reps you could already tell the guy had it. I haven't gotten that same feeling from this group yet, and 8 or 10 live snaps isn't nothing at this stage of camp. Here's the part that should genuinely worry Raiders fans further down the road. Not just for this season, but structurally. The front office had an obvious need at defensive tackle and largely punted on it. They brought in Benito Jones, that didn't work out, and he's gone now. They took a swing on a 7th-round developmental piece, and historically, interior defensive linemen picked that late almost never become difference makers. If you want a genuine run stuffer who can also collapse the pocket on passing downs, you're typically paying a premium in the first 3 or 4 rounds, because that specific archetype is rare and every team in the league wants one, which is worth bringing up right now because the upcoming draft class is loaded at exactly this position. Some evaluators are already floating comparisons to the 2019 class that produced Christian Wilkins, Dexter Lawrence, and Jeffrey Simmons in the same cycle. And this group could realistically push out 3 or 4 first-round interior defenders. If Las Vegas is serious about fixing this for the long haul, that's likely where the real solution has to come from, because I don't see enough on the current roster to trust it heading into the fall. I want to be clear about why this matters. Beyond one rough practice period, a defense that can rush the passer but can't stop the run is a defense that's always playing from behind in the game plan, because opposing coordinators will simply lean on the ground game until the Raiders prove they can stop it. That's not hypothetical. That's what just happened twice in a row against 2 different opponents with 2 different offensive identities. If this holds, once the games start counting, it changes how every defensive coordinator on the schedule approaches attacking this front 7, and it puts more pressure on an offense that's still figuring out its own identity to win shootouts instead of controlling games. Let's shift to the parts of this practice that should actually make Raiders fans feel a little better, because there were real bright spots buried in here too. Quay Walker continues to look like the clear top linebacker on this roster, and Cody Lindenberg might genuinely be pushing for the 2nd starting spot ahead of Tommy Eichenberg at this point in camp. I'm not trying to blow a preseason flash into something bigger than it is, but Lindenberg has looked composed and instinctive throughout camp, to the point where if Nicholas Morrow or Walker need a breather, or if either one hits a rough patch during the season, I'd trust Lindenberg to step in without becoming a liability. Both linebackers reportedly came away with interceptions during this session. A player whose name I'm still tracking down from secondhand reports also picked up a couple of pass breakups that stood out on tape. And Jamal Adams got extended run with the starting secondary as well, which is worth watching closely as that group continues sorting itself out before games start counting for real. If there's a silver lining buried inside an otherwise rough day up front, it's that the second level of this defense looks further along than I expected coming out of the offseason. Linebacker was supposed to be a stabilizing group, not a standout one, and right now it's trending toward the latter. That doesn't erase what happened on the interior, but it gives the coaching staff something to lean on while they sort out the rest of the puzzle. On offense, the story is more layered than a simple good day or bad day verdict. Kirk Cousins found Brock Bowers for a touchdown during a red zone period, and by most accounts, Bowers had the best overall day of any offensive player on that field, hauling in a deep post earlier in the session before capping it off with the score. That's genuinely encouraging, because Bowers creating matchup problems against an elite defense is exactly the kind of thing that should translate directly into production once games actually matter. Fernando Mendoza also saw extended run with the starters in a twist nobody really expected walking into the day, subbing in during certain team periods while Cousins got rest. That's worth watching, not because it signals any kind of quarterback controversy, but because reps against a defense this talented are genuinely valuable developmental work for a young passer, even when the results come back mixed. And they were mixed. Mendoza reportedly threw a near interception toward Kamari Lassiter before actually throwing the pick six to Petrie 2 snaps later. And then Cousins himself got picked off and had it returned for a score during the final team period. Turnovers against a defense with this much talent aren't shocking on their own, but stacking several of them into one session is still something a coaching staff wants, cleaned up before the regular season arrives. Where the offense really stalled out was running the football against Houston's top defensive unit. Multiple reporters used the exact same word to describe it: bleak. When Mike Washington and Ashton Jeanty tried to find room against the Texans starters. I want to add context here instead of spiraling into panic, because a joint practice period doesn't fully replicate live game flow. In an actual game, a coaching staff gets multiple possessions to adjust in real time, moving Bowers around, changing protections, calling shot plays off tendencies they've noticed mid-drive. There's no halftime speech fixing anything mid-period out here. It's drive by drive, problem solving. And if the Raiders struggle in one period against a defense this talented, that doesn't necessarily predict how they'd perform across an 11-possession game with real in-game adjustments mixed in. Against Houston's second and third string units, though, Washington looked considerably better, breaking off a physical touchdown run and stiff-arming a defender along the way, which at least confirms the juice is there once the matchup evens out a little. So where does all of this actually leave me? The pass rush flashed real juice, with Max Crosby getting home a couple of times and another interior piece generating pressure of his own. And that's a legitimate bright spot heading into the season. The linebacker duo of Walker and Lindenberg is starting to look like a genuine strength rather than a hopeful projection. But the run defense remains the exact concern I've had since the offseason, and now it's showing up on tape in back-to-back sessions against two completely different opponents, instead of just living quietly inside a scouting report. The offensive line, without its best interior piece anywhere on the field, had stretches where Anderson and Hunter made life genuinely difficult. And while I still believe in the ceiling of this group once everyone's healthy, health has been the exact word that's haunted Powers Johnson through his young career so far. And until that changes, I'm not comfortable calling this line a finished product. None of this is the final word on how this season plays out. The Raiders haven't installed their full offensive system yet. This was a road trip to Houston against arguably the best defensive roster in the sport, and preseason results have a habit of meaning almost nothing by the time December rolls around. But when the same weakness shows up in back-to-back outings against two very different opponents, you stop calling it a coincidence and start calling it a trend worth watching closely as final roster cuts approach.